Detective Inspector Marcus Thompson had worked security for the British royal family for over 15 years. He had seen everything from small palace scandals to major security breaches. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to uncover in the spring of 2019. It started on a quiet Tuesday morning when Marcus was reviewing the daily security reports at Kensington Palace. Prince Harry and Meghan had been living there for several months, and the media attention around them was unlike anything Marcus had experienced before. Every day brought new stories, new headlines, and new controversies. What bothered Marcus wasn't the media attention itself. Royal family members had always dealt with press coverage. What concerned him was how accurate some of these stories were. Details that should have been private were appearing in newspapers with shocking precision. Someone was talking, and Marcus was determined to find out who. The first clue came when Marcus noticed a pattern in the timing of certain news stories. Major revelations about Harry and Meghan's private conversations, their disagreements with other royal family members, and their future plans were appearing in the press just days after these events actually happened. The speed was unusual. Even the most well-connected royal reporters typically took weeks to gather such detailed information. Marcus began keeping his own record of events. He noted when private meetings took place, who attended them, and when related stories appeared in the media. His notebook filled up quickly with dates, times, and observations. A picture was starting to emerge, but it wasn't clear yet. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult week in March. Harry and Meghan had just announced their decision to step back from their senior royal duties. The announcement had shocked the public and created chaos within the royal household. But what shocked Marcus even more was reading about private conversations that had taken place behind closed doors just 48 hours earlier. One newspaper article described in detail a heated argument between Harry and his father, Prince Charles. The article quoted specific phrases that Harry had used and mentioned his exact facial expressions during the conversation. Marcus had been present during that meeting, standing guard outside the door. He knew that only 5 people had been in that room, and none of them should have been talking to reporters. That evening, Marcus decided to investigate more seriously. He started by reviewing the palace's staff schedules and access records. Who had been working during the times when these private events took place? Who had access to the areas where sensitive conversations were happening? The list was longer than he expected, but it was a starting point. Marcus also began paying closer attention to the staff's behavior. He watched for nervous glances, hushed phone calls, and unusual patterns in people's daily routines. His years of security training had taught him to notice small details that others might miss. People who were hiding something often revealed themselves through subtle changes in their normal behavior. The palace employed hundreds of people in various roles. There were housekeepers, cooks, gardeners, drivers, secretaries, and personal assistants. Many of them had worked for the royal family for decades and were considered completely trustworthy. But Marcus knew that financial pressure, personal problems, or simple greed could make anyone vulnerable to temptation. He began reviewing personnel files, looking for any staff members who might be experiencing financial difficulties or personal problems. The files revealed several interesting cases, but nothing that immediately pointed to a specific suspect. Marcus realized he needed to be more systematic in his approach. The next step was to create a more detailed timeline of events. Marcus went back through 6 months of newspaper clippings, matching them with his security logs and staff schedules. He was looking for patterns that might reveal who had access to information when it was leaked to the press. One name started appearing more frequently than others in his analysis. Sarah Mitchell was a relatively new member of the household staff. She had been hired as a personal assistant just 8 months earlier, around the same time that the unusually accurate media stories began appearing. Her background check had been clean, and she had excellent references from her previous employers. But Marcus noticed something interesting about Sarah's work schedule. She often stayed late at the palace, long after her official duties were finished. When Marcus checked with other staff members, they mentioned that Sarah was very dedicated and always volunteering to help with additional tasks. While this seemed admirable on the surface, it also meant she had access to areas and information that weren't strictly part of her job responsibilities. Marcus decided to observe Sarah more carefully. He began tracking her movements throughout the palace, noting when she was present during important meetings or events. He also started paying attention to her interactions with other staff members and visitors. What he discovered was troubling. Sarah had a habit of lingering near doorways during private conversations. She often volunteered to clean or organize areas where sensitive discussions were taking place. And she frequently worked alone in offices where important documents were kept. But Marcus needed more than suspicious behavior to prove that Sarah was leaking information. He needed concrete evidence that would stand up to scrutiny. This meant he had to be even more careful and methodical in his investigation. The opportunity for a breakthrough came when Marcus learned about an upcoming private meeting between Harry, Meghan, and senior palace officials. The meeting was scheduled to discuss their future roles within the royal family, and it was expected to be highly confidential. Marcus decided to use this meeting as a test. He created a false piece of information and made sure that only Sarah would have access to it. If this false information appeared in the media, he would know for certain that she was the leak. The plan was risky, but Marcus felt he had no choice. The security of the royal family was at stake, and he couldn't allow the situation to continue. The false information Marcus planted was about a supposed argument between Meghan and Kate Middleton over wedding planning details. The story was believable but completely fictional. Marcus made sure that only Sarah would see the document containing this information, and then he waited to see what would happen. 3 days later, the story appeared almost word for word in a major British newspaper. The headline read, "Meghan and Kate's secret feud over royal wedding plans revealed." The article contained the exact details that Marcus had included in his fake document, including specific quotes and descriptions of the supposed argument. Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and disappointment. He was pleased that his investigation had succeeded, but he was sad to confirm that someone within the palace was betraying the trust of the royal family. Now he faced the difficult task of gathering enough evidence to confront Sarah and prove her guilt beyond any doubt. Over the next few weeks, Marcus continued his careful observation of Sarah's activities. He documented her access to sensitive areas, her presence during important events, and her interactions with people outside the palace. He also began investigating her personal life, looking for clues about why she might be selling information to the press. What he discovered was that Sarah was facing significant financial pressure. She had recently gone through an expensive divorce and was struggling to pay her legal bills. She also had an elderly mother who required expensive medical care. While these circumstances didn't excuse her actions, they helped explain her motivation. Marcus also learned that Sarah had been approached by a journalist who specialized in royal family stories. This journalist had a reputation for paying well for exclusive information, and he had cultivated relationships with several palace staff members over the years. Sarah wasn't his only source, but she had become one of his most valuable contacts. The journalist's name was David Reynolds, and he worked for one of Britain's most popular tabloid newspapers. Reynolds had built his career on royal scoops, and he was known for his ability to get information that other reporters couldn't access. He was also known for being completely ruthless in his pursuit of stories. Marcus realized that Sarah was probably just one part of a larger network of informants that Reynolds had developed within the royal household. This meant that exposing Sarah might not solve the entire problem, but it was an important first step in protecting the privacy of the royal family. As Marcus continued gathering evidence, he became increasingly concerned about the potential damage that Sarah's leaks were causing. The stories weren't just embarrassing the royal family, they were also creating real security risks. When private conversations and future plans were made public, it became much harder to protect the royal family members from potential threats. Marcus knew he had to act soon, but he also knew he had to be absolutely certain of his facts before making any accusations. The consequences of being wrong would be severe, both for his own career and for an innocent person's reputation. He decided to gather just a little more evidence before taking his findings to his superiors. The final piece of evidence came when Marcus discovered that Sarah had been taking photographs of confidential documents with her personal phone. Palace security cameras had captured her doing this on several occasions, though the images weren't clear enough to see exactly what documents she was photographing. Marcus arranged to have Sarah's phone activity monitored more closely, working with the palace's technical security team. They discovered that she was regularly sending encrypted messages to an unknown contact, always during her breaks or after her official work hours had ended. With this evidence in hand, Marcus felt confident that he had built a solid case against Sarah. He prepared a comprehensive report detailing his investigation, including timelines, evidence, and his conclusions. The report was thorough and professional, presenting the facts without emotional commentary or personal opinions. But, before submitting his report, Marcus decided to conduct one final test. He created another piece of false information, this time about a supposed secret meeting between Harry and his grandmother, the Queen. The story included specific details about the Queen's supposed concerns about Harry and Meghan's decisions. Once again, Marcus made sure that only Sarah had access to this information. And, once again, the story appeared in the press within days, with all the fabricated details intact. This final test confirmed beyond any doubt that Sarah was the source of the leaks. Marcus also noticed something else interesting. The stories that appeared in the press weren't just based on the information that Sarah was providing. They were being enhanced and dramatized by the journalist who was receiving her reports. David Reynolds was taking Sarah's basic facts and turning them into sensationalized stories that would attract more readers and sell more newspapers. This realization helped Marcus understand why some of the published stories seemed more dramatic than the actual events they described. Sarah was providing accurate information, but Reynolds was adding his own interpretation and speculation to make the stories more compelling. The investigation had taken Marcus nearly 4 months to complete, but he now had everything he needed to expose the source of the leaks. He had documented evidence, confirmed patterns, and clear proof that Sarah Mitchell was selling information about the royal family to David Reynolds. As Marcus prepared to submit his report and confront Sarah with his findings, he reflected on how the investigation had unfolded. It had required patience, careful observation, and methodical analysis of seemingly unconnected events. But, most importantly, it had required him to think like both a security professional and a detective. The case had also taught Marcus something important about the modern challenges facing royal security. In the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, protecting the privacy of the royal family was more difficult than ever. People were willing to pay substantial amounts of money for exclusive information, and this created powerful incentives for palace staff to betray their trust. Marcus knew that exposing Sarah was just the beginning. The royal household would need to review its security procedures, improve its staff screening processes, and find better ways to protect sensitive information. The investigation had revealed vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed to prevent similar problems in the future. But, for now, Marcus's job was to present his findings and let his superiors decide how to handle the situation. He had done his job as a security professional, following the evidence wherever it led and building a case that could withstand scrutiny. The next phase of the story would involve confronting Sarah, dealing with the legal implications of her actions, and working to repair the damage that had been done to the royal family's privacy and security. The morning Marcus decided to confront Sarah Mitchell, he arrived at Kensington Palace earlier than usual. His report was complete, and he had briefed his superior officers about his findings. They had given him permission to question Sarah directly, but they warned him to be careful and professional. The situation was delicate, and any mistakes could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Marcus had spent the previous evening rehearsing how he would approach the conversation. He wanted to give Sarah a chance to explain her actions and possibly cooperate with the investigation. While her betrayal of trust was serious, Marcus understood that people sometimes made poor decisions when they were under financial pressure or personal stress. Sarah arrived at work at her usual time, 8:30 in the morning. Marcus watched her go through her normal routine, checking her assignments for the day and greeting her colleagues. She seemed calm and relaxed, showing no signs of anxiety or guilt. This made Marcus wonder if she fully understood the seriousness of what she had been doing. At 10 a.m., Marcus approached Sarah and asked her to come with him to a private office for a brief meeting. He told her it was a routine security matter and that she wasn't in any trouble. Sarah seemed slightly curious but not concerned as she followed him down the hallway. The office Marcus had chosen was small and comfortable, with two chairs facing each other across a simple desk. He had deliberately avoided using an intimidating interrogation room, hoping that a more relaxed setting would encourage Sarah to be honest with him. "Sarah, I want to talk to you about something important," Marcus began, keeping his voice calm and professional. "Over the past few months, we've noticed that very detailed information about the royal family's private activities has been appearing in the newspapers. Information that should have been kept confidential." Sarah's expression didn't change immediately, but Marcus noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't a routine conversation. "I don't understand what this has to do with me," Sarah replied. "I would never share private information about my work. I take my responsibilities very seriously." Marcus nodded and pulled out a folder containing copies of newspaper articles and his investigation notes. "I believe you do take your job seriously, Sarah. That's why I'm hoping you can help me understand how these stories are getting out." He showed her several newspaper clippings, pointing out the level of detail they contained. These articles describe private conversations and events with remarkable accuracy. Someone with access to very confidential information has been sharing it with reporters. Sarah looked at the newspaper clippings, but her expression remained neutral. "There are a lot of people who work here, Mr. Thompson. And people talk. Maybe the information is coming from multiple sources." "That's possible," Marcus agreed. "But my investigation has shown a very specific pattern. The most detailed stories have appeared in papers written by David Reynolds, and they've all been published within days of the events they describe." At the mention of David Reynolds' name, Sarah's composure faltered slightly. Marcus saw a flash of recognition in her eyes before she quickly looked away. "I don't know anyone by that name," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Marcus opened his folder and pulled out photographs from the palace security cameras. The images showed Sarah taking pictures of documents with her phone, though the documents themselves weren't clearly visible. "These photographs were taken by our security systems over the past few weeks," Marcus explained. "They show you photographing confidential documents during your work hours. Can you explain what you were doing?" Sarah stared at the photographs for a long moment, her face growing pale. Marcus could see that she was struggling to come up with an explanation that would sound believable. I sometimes take pictures to remind myself of important details," she said finally. "It helps me do my job better." "There's nothing wrong with that." "Normally, no," Marcus agreed. "But our technical team has also been monitoring the palace's communication networks. They've detected that you've been sending encrypted messages to an outside contact on a regular basis, always shortly after photographing these documents." The color drained completely from Sarah's face. She now understood that Marcus knew much more than she had initially realized. Her hands began to shake slightly as she set the photographs down on the desk. "Sarah, I want to help you," Marcus continued, his voice remaining gentle but firm. "I know you've been going through financial difficulties. I know about your divorce and your mother's medical expenses. I understand that people sometimes make decisions they wouldn't normally make when they're under pressure." Tears began forming in Sarah's eyes. The months of secrecy and guilt were finally catching up with her. Marcus could see that she was on the verge of breaking down, and he pushed forward with his questioning. "David Reynolds approached you, didn't he?" Marcus asked. "He offered you money for information about the royal family. At first, it probably seemed like harmless gossip. But then, the requests became more specific, and the payments became larger." Sarah covered her face with her hands and began crying quietly. Marcus waited patiently, giving her time to compose herself. He knew that the next few minutes would be crucial in determining how this situation would be resolved. "I never meant for it to go this far," Sarah whispered through her tears. "It started so innocently. David just wanted to know about general activities, things that would be made public anyway. He said he was just trying to get ahead of other reporters. But it didn't stay that way, Marcus prompted gently. Sarah shook her head. No, it didn't. He kept asking for more specific information. Private conversations, personal details, future plans. And he kept offering more money. I tried to stop several times, but he said he would expose me if I didn't continue cooperating. This revelation interested Marcus greatly. If David Reynolds had been blackmailing Sarah to continue providing information, it changed the legal situation significantly. Sarah wasn't just a paid informant, she was also a victim of extortion. Sarah, I need you to tell me everything, Marcus said. How did David first approach you? What kind of information was he asking for? How much money was he paying you? And, most importantly, has he threatened you or your family? Over the next hour, Sarah told Marcus the complete story of her relationship with David Reynolds. It had begun 6 months earlier when Reynolds had approached her in a coffee shop near the palace. He had introduced himself as a journalist and complimented her on her work with the royal family. Reynolds had been charming and friendly, and he had seemed genuinely interested in Sarah as a person. He had listened sympathetically when she mentioned her financial problems and had suggested that he might be able to help her earn some extra money. At first, Reynolds had only asked for general information about the royal family's daily activities. What time did they wake up? What did they like to eat? Who visited them regularly? Sarah had thought this information was harmless, and Reynolds had paid her well for it. But, gradually, Reynolds had begun asking for more sensitive information. He wanted to know about private conversations, family disputes, and confidential plans. When Sarah had expressed concern about sharing such personal details, Reynolds had reminded her about the money she owed and suggested that she couldn't afford to be too picky about how she earned it. The situation had become even more complicated when Reynolds had started recording their conversations. He had told Sarah that the recordings were for his own notes, but she suspected that he was keeping them as insurance in case she tried to stop cooperating with him. He has recordings of me talking about private royal family matters, Sarah explained to Marcus. If those recordings were made public, I would not only lose my job, but I might face criminal charges. He knows I can't afford a legal battle. Marcus took detailed notes as Sarah described her interactions with Reynolds. The journalist had been clever in how he had manipulated Sarah, gradually increasing his demands while making it more difficult for her to escape from their arrangement. How much money did he pay you in total? Marcus asked. About £15,000 over 6 months, Sarah replied. It seemed like a lot of money at the time, but now I realize it was nothing compared to how much he was probably earning from the stories he wrote using my information. Marcus also learned that Reynolds had other sources within the royal household. Sarah didn't know who they were, but Reynolds had mentioned that he had multiple contacts and that Sarah was just one part of his information network. This revelation confirmed Marcus's suspicion that the problem was larger than just one disloyal staff member. Reynolds had been systematically building a network of informants within the palace, using a combination of financial incentives and threats to keep them cooperating. Sarah, what you've told me is very serious, Marcus said when she finished her story. You've violated your employment contract and potentially broken several laws. But the fact that Reynolds was threatening and blackmailing you changes things significantly. Sarah looked up hopefully. What does that mean for me? It means that you're not just a perpetrator in this situation, you're also a victim, Marcus explained. If you're willing to cooperate fully with our investigation and help us expose Reynolds' entire operation, it might be possible to work out some kind of arrangement that takes your circumstances into account. Sarah nodded eagerly. I'll do whatever I can to help. I never wanted to hurt the royal family. I was just desperate and scared. Marcus spent another hour going through the specific details of Sarah's communications with Reynolds. He wanted to understand exactly how their system worked, when they communicated, and what kind of information Reynolds was most interested in receiving. Sarah explained that Reynolds had given her a special phone that used encrypted messaging apps to communicate with him. She was supposed to send him updates at least twice a week, and more often if something particularly interesting happened. Reynolds had also taught Sarah how to take photographs of documents without being detected, and he had provided her with a small camera that was disguised as a pen. The camera could take high-quality photographs of documents even in low-light conditions. He was very professional about the whole operation, Sarah admitted. He had obviously done this before with other people. He knew exactly how to avoid getting caught, and he taught me all of his techniques. Marcus realized that he was dealing with a sophisticated espionage operation, not just casual information sharing. Reynolds had turned palace staff members into professional spies, complete with specialized equipment and communication protocols. The scope of the operation made Marcus even more determined to expose it completely. If Reynolds was allowed to continue operating, he would keep recruiting new informants and damaging the royal family's privacy and security. "Sarah, I need you to continue communicating with Reynolds for a little while longer," Marcus said. "But, from now on, you'll be working with us to gather evidence against him. We need to document exactly how he operates so we can build a strong legal case." Sarah looked nervous about this proposal. "What if he finds out what I'm doing? He said he has contacts everywhere, and he might have ways of knowing if I'm being investigated." "We'll protect you," Marcus assured her. "And we'll be very careful about how we proceed. But we need your cooperation to catch Reynolds and shut down his entire network." Marcus also explained that Sarah would need to meet with palace lawyers to discuss her situation. While her cooperation would be taken into account, she had still violated her employment contract and potentially broken the law. There would likely be consequences, but working with the investigation would help minimize them. "What about my job?" Sarah asked. "Will I be fired immediately?" "That decision will be made by people above my level," Marcus replied honestly. "But I suspect that your employment will be terminated, yes. However, if you cooperate fully with our investigation, it's possible that we can arrange for you to find other employment that doesn't involve access to sensitive information." Sarah nodded sadly. She had known that her actions would eventually have consequences, but the reality of losing her job was still difficult to accept. Before ending their meeting, Marcus gave Sarah specific instructions about how to continue her communications with Reynolds without arousing his suspicion. She was to continue sending him information, but everything she sent would be approved by the investigation team first. The information Sarah would be sending would be a mixture of harmless facts and carefully crafted false details designed to test Reynolds' network and gather evidence about his methods. It was a delicate balance between maintaining her cover and avoiding any real damage to the royal family. As Sarah left the office, Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He was pleased that he had finally exposed the source of the leaks, but he was worried about the larger implications of what he had discovered. Reynolds' operation was more sophisticated and extensive than he had initially realized. Marcus immediately called a meeting with his superior officers to brief them on what he had learned from Sarah. The palace would need to take immediate action to protect itself from further security breaches, and they would need to coordinate with law enforcement to build a case against Reynolds. The investigation was entering a new and more complex phase. Marcus had solved the mystery of who was leaking information, but now he faced the much bigger challenge of dismantling an entire espionage network and preventing similar problems in the future. That evening, as Marcus reviewed his notes from the meeting with Sarah, he reflected on how the investigation had evolved. What had started as a simple question about media leaks had become a complex case involving blackmail, espionage, and organized criminal activity. Marcus knew that the hardest part of the investigation was still ahead of him. Catching Sarah had been difficult, but exposing and prosecuting David Reynolds would be much more challenging. Reynolds was an experienced journalist with powerful connections and sophisticated methods for protecting himself. But Marcus was determined to see the investigation through to its conclusion. The security and privacy of the royal family depended on it, and Marcus took that responsibility very seriously. The next phase of the investigation would test all of his skills and experience as a security professional. Working with Sarah Mitchell as an informant proved to be more challenging than Marcus Thompson had anticipated. Over the following weeks, he discovered that David Reynolds was running a sophisticated operation that involved multiple sources within not just Kensington Palace, but across the entire royal household network. Sarah's continued communications with Reynolds, now monitored and controlled by Marcus's team, revealed the extent of the journalist's information-gathering system. Reynolds wasn't just interested in gossip and rumors. He was systematically collecting intelligence about the royal family's private lives, business dealings, and future plans. The operation required careful coordination between Marcus and the palace's legal team. Every message that Sarah sent to Reynolds had to be reviewed by lawyers to ensure it wouldn't create legal problems or cause real harm to the royal family. They also had to make sure the information seemed authentic enough to maintain Reynolds' trust in Sarah as a source. Marcus learned that Reynolds had established a complex payment system for his informants. Rather than paying them directly, he used a network of intermediaries and shell companies to transfer money. This made it much harder for authorities to track the payments and identify all of his sources. The journalist had also developed sophisticated security measures to protect himself and his operation. He used multiple encrypted communication channels, frequently changed his contact methods, and never met his sources in the same location twice. Reynolds had clearly learned from other journalists who had been caught paying for information illegally. Through Sarah's continued communications with Reynolds, Marcus began to understand the full scope of what the journalist was trying to accomplish. Reynolds wasn't just looking for individual stories about the royal family. He was building a comprehensive database of information that he could use to write a tell-all book about the inner workings of the modern monarchy. This revelation made Marcus realize that the stakes were much higher than he had originally thought. Reynolds wasn't just violating the royal family's privacy, he was potentially threatening the stability and reputation of the entire institution of the monarchy. Marcus also discovered that Reynolds had sources in multiple royal households. Through careful analysis of the stories that had appeared in various newspapers, Marcus identified information that could only have come from staff members working at Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and other royal residences. The network appeared to include housekeepers, drivers, security guards, personal assistants, and even some middle management staff members. Reynolds had been remarkably successful in recruiting informants from every level of the royal household hierarchy. What made the situation even more concerning was that Reynolds seemed to have inside information about the royal family's security arrangements. Some of his published stories contained details about travel plans, security protocols, and protective measures that posed genuine risks to the safety of royal family members. Marcus briefed his superiors about these security implications, and the decision was made to involve law enforcement more directly in the investigation. The Metropolitan Police's specialist units that dealt with royal protection and national security were brought into the case. Working with the police added new resources to the investigation, but it also made the situation more complex. Marcus had to coordinate his activities with multiple law enforcement agencies while still maintaining the secrecy necessary to avoid alerting Reynolds to the investigation. The police brought sophisticated surveillance and intelligence-gathering capabilities to the case. They were able to monitor Reynolds' communications more effectively and track his financial transactions. This additional information helped Marcus understand how the journalist's network operated and who else might be involved. One of the most significant discoveries came when police surveillance revealed that Reynolds was working with an editor at his newspaper who was coordinating the publication of stories based on information from multiple royal household sources. This editor, Janet Morrison, was essentially managing Reynolds' entire operation from within the newspaper. Morrison had been working in royal reporting for over 20 years and had developed extensive contacts throughout the British media industry. She knew which stories would generate the most public interest and how to time their publication for maximum impact. The collaboration between Reynolds and Morrison had created a sophisticated media operation that went far beyond simple gossip reporting. They were essentially running an intelligence service focused on the royal family, with the goal of generating profitable stories and building Morrison's reputation as Britain's premier royal correspondent. Marcus learned that Morrison had been encouraging Reynolds to expand his network of sources and had provided him with additional funding to pay informants. She had also helped him identify specific types of information that would be most valuable for their stories. The investigation revealed that Morrison had connections to other journalists and media organizations across Europe. Some of the information that Reynolds was gathering was being shared with foreign publications, raising concerns about the international implications of the security breach. As Marcus delved deeper into the network, he discovered that Sarah Mitchell wasn't even one of Reynolds's most valuable sources. There were other palace staff members who had access to much more sensitive information and were being paid significantly more money for their cooperation. One of these sources appeared to be someone with access to the royal family's financial records and business dealings. Stories had appeared in the press that contained detailed information about investments, property transactions, and other private financial matters that should have been completely confidential. Another source seemed to have access to private correspondence between royal family members. Several stories had quoted from personal letters and emails, suggesting that someone was either intercepting electronic communications or had access to private filing systems. The scope of the infiltration was shocking. Marcus realized that Reynolds had managed to place informants in almost every aspect of the royal household's operations. The journalist had essentially created his own intelligence network within the British royal establishment. Marcus worked with the police to identify these other sources by analyzing the timing and content of published stories. The process was slow and methodical, requiring careful comparison of hundreds of newspaper articles with palace staff schedules and access records. One breakthrough came when police surveillance captured Reynolds meeting with a man who was later identified as Thomas Bradley, a senior clerk who worked in the royal household's financial administration office. Bradley had access to sensitive financial records and had apparently been providing Reynolds with information about the royal family's private business dealings. The discovery of Bradley's involvement was particularly concerning because his position gave him access to information that could potentially be used for insider trading or other financial crimes. The investigation expanded to include financial regulatory authorities who were concerned about possible market manipulation. Another significant discovery was the identification of Margaret Chen, a communications specialist who worked in the palace press office. Chen had access to advance information about royal family announcements and had apparently been sharing this information with Reynolds before it was made public. Chen's involvement was especially troubling because she was supposed to be part of the team protecting the royal family's public image. Instead, she was undermining their privacy and potentially damaging their reputation for personal financial gain. Marcus also learned that Reynolds had been using social media and online platforms to gather additional information about the royal family. He had created fake social media accounts and was using them to monitor the online activities of royal family members and their friends. The journalist had also been paying freelance photographers and social media influencers to provide him with photographs and information about the royal family's private activities. This extended network of casual informants supplemented the intelligence he was receiving from his sources within the palace. The investigation revealed that Reynolds was earning substantial amounts of money from his royal family coverage. His stories were being syndicated to newspapers and magazines around the world, and he was receiving speaking fees and book advance payments based on his reputation as an expert on royal affairs. Morrison, the editor who was coordinating Reynolds's operation, was also benefiting financially from the arrangement. Her newspaper had seen increased circulation and advertising revenue as a result of their exclusive royal family stories, and Morrison had received bonuses and promotions based on her successful management of their royal coverage. The financial incentives driving the entire operation were substantial. Marcus calculated that Reynolds and his network of informants were collectively earning hundreds of thousands of pounds per year from their intelligence-gathering activities. This level of financial motivation explained why Reynolds had been so successful in recruiting sources within the royal household. Many palace staff members earned relatively modest salaries, and the additional income from Reynolds's payments was extremely attractive to people facing financial pressures. Marcus also discovered that Reynolds had been using his informants to gather information that wasn't directly related to published stories. The journalist was building comprehensive files on royal family members that included personal details, relationship information, and potential scandal material that could be used for future stories or as leverage in negotiations. This systematic intelligence gathering went far beyond normal journalistic activity and bordered on espionage. Reynolds was essentially running a private intelligence service focused on the British royal family, with the goal of controlling the narrative around their public and private lives. The investigation also revealed that Reynolds had been sharing some of his information with foreign intelligence services. While this sharing appeared to be informal and motivated by personal relationships rather than formal arrangements, it raised serious national security concerns. Foreign governments were naturally interested in information about the British royal family's activities, relationships, and opinions. The intelligence that Reynolds was gathering could potentially be used to influence British policy or damage the country's international relationships. Marcus briefed senior government officials about these national security implications, and the investigation was expanded to include MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence service. This brought additional resources and expertise to the case, but it also raised the stakes considerably. The involvement of MI5 meant that the investigation was now being treated as a potential threat to national security rather than simply a breach of palace privacy. This changed the legal framework under which the investigation operated and opened up additional options for dealing with Reynolds and his network. As the investigation continued, Marcus began to appreciate the full complexity of what Reynolds had accomplished. The journalist had created a sophisticated intelligence network that rivaled the operations of professional spy agencies. His sources were well placed, his security measures were effective, and his financial resources were substantial. Breaking up this network would require careful planning and coordination between multiple law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Marcus realized that his role was evolving from palace security guard to coordinator of a complex counterintelligence operation. The challenge now was to gather enough evidence to prosecute Reynolds and his key collaborators while simultaneously identifying and neutralizing all of his sources within the royal household. This would require a carefully orchestrated series of raids, arrests, and legal proceedings. Marcus also had to consider the public relations implications of the case. When the investigation became public, it would inevitably generate significant media attention and could potentially damage the reputation of the royal family and the institutions that were supposed to protect them. The investigation was approaching a critical phase where decisions would need to be made about how to proceed with legal action against Reynolds and his network. Marcus knew that the next few weeks would determine whether the operation would be successfully shut down or whether Reynolds would escape prosecution and continue his activities from a different base of operations. The complexity of the case had grown far beyond what Marcus had originally anticipated when he first noticed the unusually accurate media stories about Prince Harry and Meghan. What had started as a simple security investigation had become a major counterintelligence operation with implications for national security and the future of the British monarchy. The decision to launch a coordinated sting operation against David Reynolds and his network came after weeks of careful planning between Marcus Thompson, the Metropolitan Police, and MI5. The operation, codenamed Operation Crown Guard, would be the largest counterintelligence action ever undertaken to protect the British royal family from media exploitation. Marcus found himself at the center of a complex web of law enforcement agencies, each bringing different expertise and resources to the case. The Metropolitan Police provided surveillance capabilities and arrest teams. MI5 contributed intelligence analysis and counter-espionage techniques. The palace legal team ensured that all actions remained within proper legal boundaries. The first phase of the operation involved using Sarah Mitchell to feed carefully crafted false information to Reynolds. The goal was to test the extent of his network and identify his other sources by tracking how the false information spread through different media outlets and royal household locations. Marcus worked with intelligence analysts to create a series of fictional stories that seemed plausible but contained subtle markers that would allow investigators to trace their path through Reynolds' network. Each piece of false information was designed to appeal to different types of sources and test different communication channels. One of the test stories involved a fictional argument between Prince Harry and Prince William over inheritance matters. The story was designed to be emotionally compelling and newsworthy, making it likely that Reynolds would want to publish it quickly. Marcus made sure that only Sarah had access to this particular story. Another test story focused on supposed secret negotiations between the royal family and Hollywood producers about a potential documentary project. This story was designed to appeal to sources who might have access to the royal family's business and media dealings. The third test story involved fake security concerns about Prince Harry and Meghan's travel plans. This information was shared with a broader group of palace staff to see if Reynolds had sources in the security department beyond his known contacts. The results of these tests were revealing. The fictional argument story appeared in Reynolds's newspaper within 48 hours, confirming that Sarah was still functioning as a reliable source. But, the other stories also appeared in various forms across different media outlets, proving that Reynolds had multiple sources throughout the palace. Most concerning was the rapid publication of the fake security story. This information appeared not only in Reynolds's newspaper but also in several international publications, suggesting that sensitive security information was being shared widely beyond just domestic media. The intelligence analysis revealed that Reynolds's network included at least 8 active sources across different royal households. These sources had access to financial records, personal correspondence, security protocols, and private family communications. The scope of the infiltration was even more extensive than Marcus had initially suspected. Based on these findings, the operation team decided to proceed with the next phase, setting up a direct sting operation targeting Reynolds himself. The plan was to use Sarah to arrange a meeting between Reynolds and a fictional news source who claimed to have access to extremely sensitive information. Marcus worked with an undercover police officer named Detective Inspector Lisa Parker, who would pose as the fictional source. Parker had extensive experience in undercover operations and had been specially trained in royal protocol and palace procedures to make her cover story believable. Parker's fictional identity was that of a senior assistant in the royal household's private secretary's office who had recently been passed over for a promotion and was looking for ways to supplement her income. This backstory provided motivation for her to become an informant while also giving her access to the type of high-level information that would interest Reynolds. The setup required careful preparation. Parker needed to be familiar with genuine palace procedures and personnel to answer Reynolds's likely questions. She also needed to have plausible access to information that Reynolds would find valuable enough to justify paying a substantial sum. Sarah was instructed to introduce Parker to Reynolds as a potential new source, claiming that Parker had approached her after learning about Sarah's relationship with the journalist. The introduction would take place through encrypted messages, maintaining the security protocols that Reynolds had established. Meanwhile, surveillance teams prepared to monitor Reynolds's movements and communications leading up to the planned meeting. The goal was to gather evidence of his criminal activity while also identifying his other sources and contacts within the media industry. The legal team prepared the necessary warrants and authorizations for the surveillance and eventual arrests. The case had grown to include charges of bribery, conspiracy, blackmail, and potentially violations of the Official Secrets Act, depending on the sensitivity of the information that had been shared. Parker's first contact with Reynolds went exactly as planned. She reached out through Sarah's introduction, claiming to have access to confidential information about the royal family's financial investments and business partnerships. Reynolds responded enthusiastically, clearly excited about the prospect of gaining a new high-level source. The initial negotiations between Parker and Reynolds were conducted through encrypted messaging apps, with surveillance teams monitoring every communication. Reynolds was cautious but clearly interested in what Parker claimed she could provide. Reynolds offered Parker £5,000 for a sample of the type of information she could access. He specifically requested details about the royal family's property investments and any business dealings that weren't public knowledge. This request confirmed that Reynolds was seeking information that could have significant financial and security implications. Parker provided Reynolds with carefully crafted false information about a fictional property investment, designed to seem authentic while containing subtle markers that would identify it as part of the sting operation. Reynolds accepted the information eagerly and arranged to meet Parker in person to discuss a more formal arrangement. The meeting was scheduled for a quiet restaurant in central London, chosen by Reynolds as a location where they could talk privately without attracting attention. Surveillance teams prepared to monitor the meeting from multiple angles, using both visual surveillance and electronic monitoring equipment. Marcus coordinated the surveillance operation from a mobile command center parked several blocks away from the restaurant. He could monitor the audio and video feeds from Parker's hidden recording devices while also tracking the positions of all the surveillance teams. The meeting began exactly as planned. Reynolds arrived at the restaurant first and chose a corner table that provided privacy and good sightlines to watch for potential surveillance. Parker arrived 15 minutes later, playing the role of a nervous palace employee who was taking a big risk by meeting with a journalist. Reynolds immediately began assessing Parker's credibility, asking detailed questions about her job responsibilities and access to confidential information. Parker's preparation paid off as she was able to answer his questions convincingly, demonstrating knowledge of palace procedures and personnel. The conversation quickly turned to financial arrangements. Reynolds explained his payment system, describing how he used intermediary companies and cash payments to avoid creating paper trails that could be traced back to him or his informants. This explanation provided crucial evidence of his systematic approach to corrupting palace staff. Reynolds also revealed details about his other sources during the conversation, apparently confident that Parker was legitimate and could be trusted with sensitive information about his operation. He described having sources in multiple royal households and bragged about the quality of information he was receiving. Most significantly, Reynolds admitted to recording his conversations with informants and keeping detailed files on royal family members that went far beyond published stories. He described these files as insurance policies that could be used to protect himself if his operation was ever discovered. The conversation also revealed that Reynolds was working on a major exposé that would use information from all of his sources to publish a comprehensive account of the royal family's private lives and business dealings. He claimed this project would be the biggest royal scandal in modern history. During the meeting, Reynolds offered Parker a regular payment of £10,000 per month in exchange for continuing access to confidential information. He also provided her with specialized equipment, including a camera disguised as a pen and software for encrypting digital communications. The meeting lasted for nearly 2 hours, during which Reynolds provided enough evidence to support multiple criminal charges. The surveillance teams captured every detail of the conversation, including Reynolds's admissions of bribery, his descriptions of his criminal methods, and his threats against informants who might consider cooperating with authorities. As the meeting concluded, Reynolds arranged for Parker to meet with him again the following week to deliver her first regular intelligence report. This gave the operation team time to prepare for the next phase of their plan. After Parker left the restaurant, surveillance teams continued monitoring Reynolds to see what he would do with the information she had provided. They watched as he returned to his office and immediately began working on a story based on the false information about royal family property investments. The speed with which Reynolds moved to publish the false information confirmed that he was operating with minimal fact-checking or verification. He was so confident in his sources and methods that he was willing to publish potentially sensitive information without independently confirming its accuracy. This behavior provided additional evidence of Reynolds's reckless approach to journalism and his willingness to potentially damage the royal family's reputation based on unverified information from corrupt sources. The operation team decided to proceed with the arrest phase of the plan. They had gathered sufficient evidence to support charges against Reynolds, and they had identified several of his other sources through his conversations with Parker and their ongoing surveillance activities. The arrests would need to be carefully coordinated to prevent any of the suspects from destroying evidence or alerting others in the network. The operation would involve simultaneous raids on Reynolds's office and home, along with the arrest of his key collaborators including editor Janet Morrison and the identified palace sources. Marcus worked with the arrest teams to ensure that the palace sources would be taken into custody discreetly to avoid alerting other potential informants. The goal was to roll up the entire network quickly and completely, preventing anyone from escaping or continuing the operation under different arrangements. The legal team prepared comprehensive search warrants for all of the locations where evidence might be stored. They anticipated finding extensive files, recordings, and electronic communications that would document the full scope of Reynolds's intelligence gathering operation. As the arrest phase approached, Marcus reflected on how the investigation had evolved from his initial observation of suspicious media stories. The sting operation had revealed a sophisticated criminal network that posed serious threats to royal family privacy, security, and, potentially, national security. The success of Operation Crown Guard would depend on the careful execution of the arrest phase and the subsequent legal proceedings. Marcus knew that Reynolds and his collaborators would have access to experienced legal representation and would likely challenge the evidence and methods used in the investigation. But the evidence gathered during the sting operation was comprehensive and compelling. Marcus was confident that the case would result in successful prosecutions that would send a strong message about the consequences of exploiting and corrupting royal household staff for commercial gain. The next phase of the operation would test whether the British legal system was prepared to deal with the new types of media crimes that had emerged in the digital age. The case would likely establish important precedents for how similar investigations would be conducted in the future. The dawn raids began at exactly 6 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Marcus Thompson stood in the mobile command center, coordinating simultaneous operations across London as dozens of police officers executed search warrants and made arrests as part of Operation Crown Guard. The first target was David Reynolds's flat in an upscale area of West London. Armed police officers surrounded the building while plainclothes detectives approached his door. Reynolds was arrested without incident, still in his pajamas and clearly shocked by the early morning operation. Simultaneously, teams raided Reynolds's office at the newspaper, seizing computers, files, and recording equipment. The search revealed extensive documentation of his intelligence network, including detailed profiles of his royal household sources and recordings of hundreds of conversations with informants. Janet Morrison, the editor who had been coordinating Reynolds's operation, was arrested at her home in Surrey. She had attempted to destroy some documents when she saw the police approaching, but investigators were able to recover most of the material she had tried to eliminate. The most delicate aspect of the operation involved arresting the palace sources without alerting other potential informants or creating a public scandal. Marcus worked with palace security to coordinate the discreet detention of Sarah Mitchell, Thomas Bradley, Margaret Chen, and 5 other identified sources. Each arrest was carefully planned to avoid attracting attention from other staff members or the media. The suspects were taken into custody during their normal work routines and were immediately replaced by security personnel to prevent any gaps in palace operations. The search of Reynolds's office revealed the full scope of his intelligence-gathering operation. Investigators found detailed floor plans of royal residences, copies of confidential documents, and extensive surveillance photographs of royal family members and their guests. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of Reynolds's insurance files, comprehensive dossiers on each royal family member containing personal information, potential scandal material, and what appeared to be blackmail material that could be used to manipulate or control them. The files contained information that went far beyond what had been published in Reynolds's stories. There were details about personal relationships, medical information, financial problems, and private conversations that painted intimate portraits of the royal family's private lives. Marcus realized that Reynolds had been building these files not just for journalistic purposes, but as a form of power and protection. If his operation had ever been threatened, he could have used this information to damage the royal family's reputation or to negotiate his own safety. The legal proceedings began immediately after the arrests. Reynolds and his collaborators were charged with multiple offenses including bribery, conspiracy to commit fraud, blackmail, and violations of the Official Secrets Act for handling classified security information. The palace sources faced additional charges related to breach of trust and violation of their employment contracts. The severity of these charges would depend on the specific information each person had provided and the potential damage it could have caused. Sarah Mitchell's cooperation with the investigation earned her some consideration from prosecutors, but she still faced serious charges for her months of selling confidential information. Her financial problems and Reynolds's manipulation were taken into account, but couldn't excuse her systematic betrayal of trust. The media reaction to the arrests was intense but complicated. Reynolds had been a well-known and respected journalist, and his arrest raised questions about press freedom and the limits of investigative reporting. Some media organizations initially defended Reynolds as a victim of royal family paranoia and authoritarian overreach. However, as details of the operation became public through court proceedings, opinion began to shift. The systematic nature of Reynolds's intelligence gathering, his use of blackmail and manipulation, and the discovery of his insurance files made it clear that his activities went far beyond legitimate journalism. The trial proceedings revealed shocking details about the extent of the security breach. Prosecutors presented evidence that Reynolds had gained access to information about royal family travel plans, security arrangements, and private communications that could have been used by hostile foreign governments or terrorist organizations. Expert witnesses testified that the information Reynolds had gathered could have facilitated assassination attempts, kidnapping plots, or other attacks against royal family members. The security implications of his operation extended far beyond privacy violations. The court also heard evidence about the financial scope of Reynolds's operation. Over 3 years, he had paid more than £200,000 to various informants within the royal household. This money had come from story sales, book advances, and speaking engagements based on his reputation as a royal insider. Janet Morrison's role as the coordinator of the operation became clear during the trial. She had not only encouraged Reynolds to expand his network but had also provided him with additional funding from the newspaper's budget. The newspaper itself faced potential charges as a corporate entity that had benefited from criminal activity. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the extensive electronic evidence gathered during the sting operation. Recordings of Reynolds's conversations with the undercover officer provided clear proof of his criminal intentions and methods. His admissions about bribing sources and maintaining blackmail material were particularly damaging. Reynolds's defense team argued that he was engaged in legitimate journalism and that his sources had provided information voluntarily. They claimed that the royal family was trying to silence legitimate criticism and investigation of their activities. However, the evidence of systematic bribery, the use of threats and blackmail, and the discovery of the insurance files made it impossible to characterize Reynolds's activities as normal journalism. The court found that he had crossed the line from reporting news to conducting espionage. The trial of the palace sources was more complex, as each case involved different circumstances and levels of cooperation with Reynolds. Sarah Mitchell received a relatively light sentence due to her cooperation with the investigation and the evidence of Reynolds's manipulation and threats. Thomas Bradley, who had provided financial information, received a harsher sentence due to the sensitivity of the documents he had shared and the potential for this information to be used for financial crimes. His access to royal family investment records had created risks beyond simple privacy violations. Margaret Chen, the communications specialist, faced serious charges because her position had required her to protect the royal family's public image rather than undermine it. Her betrayal was seen as particularly serious given her professional responsibilities. The sentences handed down by the court sent a strong message about the seriousness of these crimes. Reynolds received 5 years in prison, while Morrison received 3 years. The palace sources received sentences ranging from suspended sentences to 2 years in prison, depending on their level of cooperation and the sensitivity of the information they had provided. Beyond the individual punishments, the case had broader implications for media regulation and royal security. New guidelines were established for journalists covering the royal family, and stricter penalties were introduced for paying public officials for confidential information. The palace implemented comprehensive security reforms based on the lessons learned from Reynolds's operation. Background checks for staff members were enhanced, access to sensitive information was more strictly controlled, and new monitoring systems were installed to detect potential security breaches. Marcus found himself at the center of these reform efforts, helping to design new security protocols and training programs for palace staff. His investigation had not only exposed a specific threat but had revealed systemic vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. The case also had international implications, as foreign media organizations had purchased some of Reynolds's stories and had potentially been exposed to classified information about British royal family security arrangements. Diplomatic discussions were held with several countries to address these security concerns. 1 year after the arrests, Marcus reflected on the long-term impact of Operation Crown Guard. The immediate threat posed by Reynolds's network had been eliminated, but the case had revealed the ongoing challenges of protecting high-profile figures in the digital age. The investigation had shown how financial pressure, technological capabilities, and sophisticated manipulation could be combined to create serious security threats. Traditional approaches to protection needed to be updated to address these new types of risks. The case had also highlighted the importance of having security professionals who could think like intelligence analysts and investigators. Marcus's background in both security and investigation had been crucial to identifying and understanding the threat posed by Reynolds's operation. The royal family's response to the crisis had been measured and professional. Rather than seeking revenge or trying to suppress information about the case, they had cooperated fully with law enforcement and had used the experience to improve their security arrangements. Prince Harry and Meghan, who had been the primary targets of Reynolds's intelligence gathering, expressed gratitude for the investigation and the protection it had provided. They also acknowledged the difficult position that some of the palace staff had been placed in by Reynolds's manipulation and threats. The case established important legal precedents for how similar investigations would be conducted in the future. The use of undercover operations, electronic surveillance, and coordination between different law enforcement agencies had proven effective in dealing with sophisticated media crimes. Marcus's role in the investigation had been recognized with commendations from both the palace and law enforcement agencies. But, for Marcus, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that he had protected the royal family and helped prevent a much larger scandal that could have damaged the monarchy itself. The investigation had also revealed the dedication and professionalism of the vast majority of palace staff, who had remained loyal despite financial pressures and personal challenges. The few who had been corrupted by Reynolds represented a tiny minority of the hundreds of people who worked to support the royal family. As Marcus continued his security work, he remained vigilant for signs of similar threats. The Reynolds case had shown that the risks facing the royal family were evolving, and security arrangements needed to evolve as well. The investigation had been successful, but it was just one battle in an ongoing effort to protect Britain's most high-profile family. The story of Operation Crown Guard became a case study in security academies and law enforcement training programs around the world. It demonstrated how patient investigation, careful analysis, and coordinated law enforcement action could successfully counter sophisticated intelligence operations. For Marcus Thompson, the guard who had followed the clues and exposed the source-feeding stories to the press, the case represented the culmination of years of training and experience. His attention to detail, investigative instincts, and professional dedication had protected not just individual royal family members, but the institution of the monarchy itself. The case closed with all the major participants held accountable for their actions, new security measures in place to prevent similar breaches, and important lessons learned about the evolving nature of threats in the modern media environment. Justice had been served, and the royal family could continue their duties with greater security and privacy protection than before.